Well, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rowan Kent. I'm the program lead at the Australian Water Partnership, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to Water Resource Management to Alleviate Water-Mediated Disasters. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in the Australian Capital Territory, and I would like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal elders, past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to all Indigenous people across the world. And it looks like we've really got quite a big spread of people across a number of countries. Water is a common theme running through the disaster cycle, as you know, with drought, storms and floods and tsunamis, just a few of the examples that impact lives and livelihoods. Today, we'll be talking about how we can alleviate disasters through better water resource management, from working through infrastructure, but also working, through more community-based disaster management and water resource management. Our moderator for today is right in the thick of it. Ms. Lita Buyukoto is the SPC Disaster Risk Team Leader, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce her. She's had 15 years of experience working in the region with Pacific Island countries on disaster risk reduction programs. The TIA has worked with technical experts from various countries, research and technical institutes, and development partners to expand the use and the application of risk information and assessment tools in decision making. The TIA is involved in global and regional expert groups, including the Pacific Resilience Partnership Technical Working Group on Disaster Risk Financing, Intergovernmental Coordination Group for Pacific Tsunami Warning and Mitigation Systems, Technical Expert Group on the Comprehensive Risk Management, and the Technical Working Group on Disaster-Related Statistics in the Asia Pacific. I couldn't think of a better person to moderate this very important session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Latia, and I'll see you at the end of the session for a wrap-up.
Vinakavalyavu, and for that sum up. Sometimes I wonder if it's really me that's being described in the intros that are given. Bula vinaka, and welcome to this session on water resources management to alleviate water-mediated disasters, organized by the Australian Water Partnership, Alluvium and the Pacific community. One thing that's been really evident is the value of strategic partnerships, particularly in the spaces that we work in, and none more so than when we're dealing with disasters in the region. We have seen over the past decade an increased reporting of water-related disasters that directly impact communities, impact our sectors, as well as infrastructure. And this often results in productivity losses. They pose an increased risk to resilience, to investments. And as we've seen with COVID, also human health impacts. So what are we doing about it? First off, for the work that we do appreciate that there is really no silver bullet when we're talking about our resilience building, and that we do need to consider a range of options that will actually help us to minimize and reduce these potential risks, but also that in realizing that there is still a need and a role for disaster preparedness, response and recovery initiatives. And we've seen that in the Pacific with flood mitigation investments, drought-related investments, particularly around some of the policy work, as well as the capacity development work that's being done with our national agencies. In the risk reduction space, in addition to the value of partnerships, we've also seen value in sharing across the South-South. And I'm so glad to say that we will hear from our counterparts from the Asia region during this event, during this session. We will have the privilege of actually hearing from 5 experts on various topics that relate to the water resources management, and particularly in mediating water-related disasters. And also, we'd like to provide you, as our audience, an opportunity to send through any comments or views through the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to type in as we're presenting. First off the block, we have Dave Hebblethwaite, who's the Water Security and Governance Coordinator at the Pacific Community. The Pacific Community is a regional organization that's actually charged with supporting it's a membership of 22 Pacific Island countries and territories to help achieve sustainable development goals through evidence-based actions as well as partnerships for resilience. Based in Fiji, Dave works with a network of country counterparts across the Pacific, some of whom you'll meet today, and works with the network, works with these counterparts actually to progress local solutions to some of the world's difficult water security challenges. Over to you, Dave. Naka.
Hey, Tanaka Latea, Mbulavanaka, Tampra Masaka, everybody joining. Greetings from the Pacific Community Suva Regional Office. I'm joined here by colleagues from Geoscience, Energy and Maritime Division here at SPC, also Fiji Government, and we've got a visitation from New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade who are here with us in the room today. So a full house at the Super Hub. And a note from Fiji, apart from my colleague Latea, who's joining from home isolation. We also have Viliami joining from Nandi. So in my presentation, I'm just going to give an introduction to this topic, a little bit of information about what we do, about what some of the nature of disaster impacts are on the Pacific region, and some examples of how water resources management can play a part. And just before I start, can I just say a special hello and acknowledgement to our colleagues and friends from the region that we can see joining in. It's great that you could join. So next slide, please. Thank you. So we'll be talking about really what role water resources management can play for Pacific resilience. And next, please. To introduce SPC, so we are a technical organisation representing 22 member countries, 14 Pacific Island countries, and a further 8 territories. Of our membership, we have significant members. 5 of our member countries have no surface water resources whatsoever, and a further 9 of our countries are home to significant communities who live on islands with no surface water resources whatsoever. So it's a resource-stretched part of the world. Next, please. We also have our members that are living in high volcanic island countries, for whom regular river system flooding is an issue, a regular and repeating issue every year in these countries. Next, please. If you look at the level of risk that has been recorded estimated through the World Risk Index process, you see that of the 12 Pacific Island country members, 8 of them had data, and of those 8, 6 of them are in the top 20 in terms of exposure, susceptibility to natural hazards. And you'll see that Pacific Island countries actually make up the top 3 globally in terms of exposure to risk. Next, please. And when we think of risk, so next, please. Thank you. When we think of water-related disasters, we think of the hydrometeorological disasters of floods and droughts, as we well should, but it's certainly not just that. They impact this region significantly. But next, if we go to looking at the impact of other hydrometeorological hazards, such as tropical cyclones, they have a profound impact through the lens of water resources, water services, and sanitation. And so certainly that's a significant issue for the region. Next, please. If we also look at geological hazards, we know that they also have an impact through the lens of water, and water resources can play a key role in responding and preparing and mitigating those hazards. Next. When you look at the total events recorded in the region, since events have been recorded, we see that the total events, cyclones are really up there in terms of the total number. I've divided here: blue are traditionally hydrometeorological events, and the brown are more geological hazards. Next, please. If you look at the impact on lives lost, historically, particularly through some serious earthquakes and tsunamis in the middle part of last century. The most lives lost have been through those. Next. But if you look at people directly affected, we see that cyclones and floods really have had the major influence in terms of the number of souls affected by disasters in the Pacific region. Next, if you look at houses destroyed, similarly, cyclones, storm surge, floods. And for cyclones, importantly, it's not just wind damage we're talking about, it's inundation damage as well. And sometimes we conflate the impacts of floods and cyclones. Many of our flood impacts are associated with cyclones and tropical lows. Next. And in terms of the estimated cost, the losses in dollars, you see that we're up around $3 trillion the region in terms of cyclone damage. And next slide, please. If you look at how that presents in any country in terms of their development progress, most countries are actually progressing, if you look at any kind of indicator such as GDP growth, progressing on a line of progress until we get to a disaster. And then that projected development path doesn't happen. Another path happens. And working out the difference between that new path and what would have happened is really key to understanding the real impact of disasters on this region. Where would this region be if it weren't for these constantly repeating hazards having an impact on our lives and our economies? And what is the role of water resources in that gap, in filling that gap, in narrowing that gap? Next, please. So I'll go very quickly through here on some of the history of tropical cyclones, just an example for the region. These are just the last 15 years in the Pacific, and these are Category 5 events. Next slide, please. As you see, as we go through, there are many more. Category 4, next slide. Category 3, next slide, Category 2. Next slide, Category 1, and then next slide, going beyond 15 years, total cyclones recorded, and you see it's a hazard for most of the region. Next slide. If we look at the impacts of these, and we see that we've had 2 Category 5 direct hits, record-breaking storms hitting our member countries in the last decade. Cyclone Pam hitting Vanuatu, having an estimated impact on GDP of 65% of the country's GDP. In 2016, Winston impacted Fiji, an estimated 30% of GDP. But then we see Cyclone Evan that didn't actually even have a direct hit on Samoa. And when it passed Samoa's waters, it was as a Category 1. But we see that the impact there was still 45% of the GDP of Samoa. So it's really profound. And just by comparison, if you think of perhaps one of the largest disasters that has affected Australia in recent years, the Millennium Drought, the impact of that is estimated to be between 1 and 1.5% GDP. So the disproportionate impacts of the Pacific are really quite profound. Next slide, please. We're going to today be talking about the disaster cycle and really about how water resources might play a part in each part of the disaster cycle, whether it be prevention or mitigation, preparation, response and recovery. Next slide, please. We'll be splitting those up in the components. Component 2, we'll be talking about prevention and preparation and some examples. And component 3, we'll be talking about recovery and response. And really, we'll be looking to see what role water resources management can play in each of those components. So some examples very quickly that we'll just touch upon, and some of our presenters will elaborate on some of these. Next slide, please. In the prevention space, some work that we've been doing in collaboration with Tuvalu and with the Government of New Zealand is working with the local community to identify a new water resource. My colleague Watea at the end of the room here is leading this work, and it's delineating a water source for the first time that can be used as a lifeline in times of drought, so that the Vaitupu community in Tuvalu does not need to rely so much on external aid every time there's a period of extended dry time. It's an example of water resources and knowledge around water resources immediate leading to prevention outcomes. Next slide, please. Example of preparation work. Some of the work that NIWA is doing in support of the region, looking at the island climate update, rainfall forecast. As you can see, that allows our island members to prepare for impacts from dry times. This is the live ICU rainfall forecast for the moment for June to August, looking at that La Nina impact that stretches all the way from Palau all the way through to French Polynesia. Next slide, please. And the island climate update goes a step further and actually identifying areas of potential water stress based on past conditions plus projected conditions. So that's showing that red zone of impact going through, particularly from Nauru all the way through to Pitcairn again. And we've seen right now many of those countries, including Kiribati and Tuvalu, particularly at the moment, that are suffering the impacts of drought. Next slide, please. Response. Examples of response happen every time there is a disaster, whether it's a hydrometeorological disaster or not. Provision of water supply, safe water supply and sanitation is really key. Water resources management is a key part of that decision-making process. And as I said, it doesn't need to be a hydrometeorological drought or a disaster. Next slide. You see, we gave the example too of the Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai volcano as being a geological hazard. It has water resources ramifications. Understanding the water resources in a country and being able to use that information to support the response can be really critical. Now, next slide. This is just an example of some work that we did with Tonga to assist with the response effort. And it all comes from water resources science and knowledge. Next slide, please. So in recovery, I'm not going to talk about that anymore. My colleague Ani from the government of Fiji is going to give a great example of some response work in Fiji. Work in Fiji that water resource management has been central to. And next slide. We'll also talk today about drought management in Kiribati and particularly in Tarawa, the atoll of Tarawa and South Tarawa in particular. And some of the work there illustrates that these efforts don't necessarily just fit to one part of the disaster cycle. Our efforts often will be hitting mitigation, they'll be hitting preparation, they'll be hitting recovery efforts as well. They can come across, can be relevant to all of those. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I guess to sum up, really our key message from the Pacific community from a water and disaster point of view is that supporting the capacity of local communities to protect and sustainably manage their water resources while maintaining safe wash practices and systems is key to building a climate and disaster resilient Pacific. Water action is climate action, and really we feel that there's probably the Pacific is one of the best regions of the world to illustrate that truth. So I'll just close off with some imagery. Next slide, please. Examples of activities underway working in water resources in the Pacific to strengthen resilience to disasters and climate. Physical infrastructure work where water resources information actually helps inform how things should be designed fit to standard. Next slide, please. Work where our countries are getting together as a community of practice to share water resources, knowledge and information. This is the Pacific Partnership for Atoll Water Security that sees atoll countries getting together to share approaches to water security, how to utilize water resources management approaches and techniques to secure water and sanitation during dry times. Next slide, please. This is an example at the regional level too, where there's work going underway to better categorise some of the water resource challenges that are faced by island communities. The atoll water inventory, which we'll send a link to, it's up there where you can actually get some more information about the specific water resources challenges, particularly facing atoll and small island communities. Next slide, please. And that's all from me, Letea. Thank you. I'm sorry we've gone a little over time. Yeah, thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very
today.
much. Thank you very much, Dave, for that. I mean, it's actually quite interesting to see the interplay between water resources management and actually disaster risk management, that the two actually go hand in hand. I don't actually see any questions in the Q&A, and please, again, feel free to post any comments or questions that you have for the speakers today. Dave, I actually had a question for you. And, this was really in the presentation that you're making is, are we seeing water resources management being considered, as part of disaster preparedness and response initiatives, including for recovery, but I guess more importantly, in some of the long-term development strategies of governments?
Thanks, Letea. I'd say that in our experience, yes and no. On the ground, yes. In the Pacific, being by some margin the least urbanized region in the world, water and sanitation is managed at a household level or a community level. And those communities are acutely aware of the role of water resources management in their resilience. As you go up the tree, the national level to the regional level, and then the international level, I think that's where we group into our silos more. So there's often a resilience community, a DRR community, water resources community. The further up you go, I feel the less that we talk with each other. So I think there is certainly scope to improve that. Dialogues like this are a really good opportunity, but there's certainly room for a lot more dialogue. That's actually one reason why we're doing some work with the Pacific Resilience Partnership at the moment, to try and insert water security as being a key resilience tool, both a risk and a tool for that discussion. But yeah, I think there's something that both communities globally could do a lot more to get together on. Thanks
again, Dave. Pinakavaluable for your presentation this afternoon. I'm sure that a number of people would be quite interested to see some of the stats that sit behind some of those slides that you showed. Vinaka again. All right, so for component 2 of our session this afternoon on water resources management for prevention and preparedness to water-mediated disasters, we've got some case studies that we're presenting. And we have, first up, Dr. Niladri Gupta, who is a senior project manager focusing on climate risk management in the Climate Resilience Department of the Asia Disaster Preparedness Center in Bangkok, Thailand. Dr. Gupta is currently involved in developing and implementing projects related to climate risk management, climate change adaptation planning, strategies and approaches for minimizing climate risks on livelihoods, food security, agriculture, and ecosystem resilience in various Asian countries. Dr. Gupta has more than 15 years of technical and research experience in geoinformatics, system dynamics and analysis, fluvial geomorphology, and water resources management. Over to you, Dr. Gupta.
Thank you, Litya. I hope I'm audible. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Alluvium and the Australian Water Partnership for the invitation to present one of the case studies. And as we move from the Pacific to the South Asia region, and you know that Bangladesh is one of the most disaster-prone countries in this region and is likely to be facing a lot of extreme events in the coming years or decades, as we see in the IPCC 6 report. But before I go into the presentation, I will say a bit about our organization. Asian Disaster Preparedness Center is an autonomous international organization that works to build the resilience of people and institutions to disaster and climate change impacts in the Asia and Pacific. So we have been working in this region for more than 34 years. And this case study is from a project that we are currently implementing in 3 Asian countries, Nepal, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And we are actually trying to figure out, as Dave was also mentioning, that how water resource management can actually be a tool for disaster preparedness and response. So we have a unique study. This is just on process. It's not yet completed. So climate informed water accounting, a framework for water management in Bangladesh. Next slide, please. So yeah, next slide. Yeah, so the most important part is that when we talk of water, if you cannot measure it, you actually cannot manage it. And we say that it's a very fugitive resource. And because it's a fugitive resource, the complexity lies in it. And we need to assess the stock and flow and variation of the resource. But we know it's very challenging, and defining the boundaries of resources is also challenging. So besides these challenges of the characteristics of the attribute of the water, the added thing is the climate change, which is likely to have a significant impact on water supply, while and it's not only the supply, it's also the demand, which will be affected by scarcity and availability. So we need to have a very effective communication of information related to water resources in the geographical region. Next slide, please. So in Bangladesh, we know that it's a country which is, it's a delta. So water is the most important component of the country's any characteristics you talk of. And the other important thing is that most of the rivers are transboundary in nature. So there are very few rivers which actually originate in Bangladesh. All of it comes from the surrounding country, especially India. So it faces a unique situation in terms of water resource management, which is further compounded by the rising sea level and frequent flooding. So it's not only the water coming from the upstream, it's also the water which is coming from the seaside. So it's being, the water is coming from both ends. And 93% of the water in Bangladesh is consumed by agricultural sector, and majority of them comes from groundwater. So it's not only the surface water, the groundwater also comes into this complexity. Now, when we talk of integrated water resource management, or the water sector as an entity, it's critically affected by the adverse impact of climate change. This is the reality, but there is another reality that globally Bangladesh has been known as the pioneer in formulating climate adaptation measures. So this climate informed water accounting, which actually support a resilient water governance. That's how our objective of developing this system came into as part of this project. And we are likely, and we are also planning to take into account the impact of climate change, so that and the potential adaptation and mitigation measures by means of this water accounting system. Next, please. So the main focus is that it's the agricultural water management we are focusing. As I showed you earlier, that 93% of the water is actually agriculture, used for agriculture. But when we talk of the water accounts, it's just actually the 1% which is the fresh water, and we are dealing with that 1%. And this climate change also comes into the factor. So when we do any accounting system, it has to be climate informed, otherwise it will of no use. Next, please. Yeah, so what we did in this initial phase of the study, we actually reviewed and assessed what is the status of the water accounting in Bangladesh currently, based on various policies, institutional frameworks, what practices the organizations carry out, the governance measures and applications that they do. And then we identified some current practices of water accounting globally, that the countries that are actually implementing some form of climate water accounting and inclusion of climate actions in this water accounting. But besides the agricultural sector, there are two other sectors which is the priority of the government. One is the industrial and the urban water accounting, because domestic uses for wash also comes into the picture. So we were looking into some standard global frameworks on water accounting, which is currently implemented by various organizations, and there are consortiums of IWMI, UNFAO, IHE Delft, who are actually practicing this extensively in Africa and some other continents. And we actually developed an appropriate water accounting framework for Bangladesh. And the initial requirements for installation and operational of this water accounting tool at the water governance level, we are actually currently in discussion with one of the with Ministry of Water Resource and its wing water resource planning organizations, WARPO. Next slide, please. So how did we come to the conclusion, or how we are actually carrying out the studies? We actually did an assessment with various stakeholders in the water sector or the users of water. So there were around 11 questions about which government agencies are the major stakeholders. So if you do a water accounting, what are the available legal and institutional and regulatory frameworks? Because things has to be run within the framework, if it has to be owned by a government. And the status of existing water accounting systems, then how it is practiced in agriculture or the industrial or the domestic sector, and what are the recent studies which have done some type of water accounting, not in terms of water demand and supply. And based on this initial review of this data of Bangladesh and the standard frameworks of water accounting which are available, we actually came up with one of the system which can be customized, which will come later in the slide. And we also thought of, or we actually saw that if we connect with the 8th 5-year plan of Bangladesh and identify the relevant policies or strategies that support implementation of water accounting, then it will be easier to mainstream or integrate into the government system. Next slide, please. So if we see the stakeholder of water sector stakeholder in Bangladesh in terms of water accounting, it's very complex. There are a lot of players. If we talk of the IWRM, then there are the Ministry of Local Government, the Ministry of Water Resource, even the Ministry of Defense, because the meteorological department is under Ministry of Defense. Then if we talk of agriculture, it's the agriculture, and as you know, as per FAO, agriculture is not only the crops, it's also the livestock and the fisheries. And if we talk of the industrial, there is under the Prime Minister's office, the Bangladesh Economic Zone Authority, and then we have the urban various municipalities, corporations. So if we have to develop a comprehensive water accounting system, we have to consider the usages and the responsibilities or the participation of all these players. So it's quite complex. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to do this as part of the study, we actually did a SWOT analysis of the water sector and the agricultural sector. So when we did of the water sector, the SWOT analysis, we saw that there are few the strengths that they have is that there is a strong commitment and leadership in water resource management in Bangladesh, both in water and agricultural sector. And it uses and promotes digital platform for information management. And there is a wealth of water resource databases, but the weakness is that when we talk of standardized water accounting framework, that doesn't exist. And there is insufficient capacity compared to the increasing demand of efficient information management. And there is no standardized water accounting system in place currently. But even if there is a wealth of resource and databases, but the sharing mechanism is not well organized. So sometimes some data that are available may not be updated or may not be reliable. So that is a complexity, but there are some things coming up in the government. We had a discussion yesterday. So the sharing mechanism is being established. And then comes when we talk of the opportunity, this type of systems actually there is a capitalization of knowledge, tools, and technical assistances. There are services available from organizations like FAO, EMI, and other international organizations who work on this type of systems. Then there is the development, operation, and maintenance at a basin scale, and the regional improved regional water resource assessment and management with application of climate-informed water accounting systems. These are opportunities if this is established. But there are also threats. There's some, obviously, in any country, the political will is an important part. So uncertain political commitment may be a threat, but in Bangladesh, it's not that much. But it's a threat which can come if the government changes. Then ensuring a secure source of funding, because systems can be established by development partners, but how does we ensure the sustainability? And so there has to be collaboration among governments. So that's another threat of collaboration gap among the government stakeholders, and the risk of inadequate projection of climate related information, because when we talk of the projections, the uncertainty comes into the picture. So there is a threat of how accurate or how accurately we can say about the projections that it is likely to happen. Next slide, please. So similarly, in the agriculture sector, we have a similar SWOT analysis, and things are more or less similar in nature, both in agriculture and water sector. But the one thing that differs between the agriculture and water sector is that the weaknesses that they have very limited information of the water users in the subsector of fisheries and livestock. And still it is seen that a crop or these sectors, the amount of water that is required, they're using more than that. So that is a major issue. That's why for resource optimization, if a country is dependent on external other countries on the supply of water from upstream, then water accounting becomes very important. And with droughts and floods, which are likely to increase in terms of frequency and intensity, if you do not have a water accounting system in a country like Bangladesh, in future it will be very difficult to actually provide water to the users. Next slide, please. So if we go off the, you can continue next, because I was thinking I will run the slide. So the standardized water account, the major gap is that standardized water accounting system in place. There is no standardized water accounting system for water management. So it is essential, as I said, to manage risks that will be increasing in frequency and intensity. Then there is a risk of inadequate projection of climate related information. There is a lack of structured system in place to measure and assess the accounts for the agricultural water use. And we have to also keep in mind, it's not the surface water, there is groundwater also. So there, if there is lack of updated and reliable data on some of these resources, which is there, especially the groundwater part, then it becomes difficult. Then evidence-informed systems to support decision making, and limited information on the water use on subsectors of fisheries and livestock, as I mentioned. So if we can actually address these issues, it will enable governance efficiency, the water resources utilization, and water security under climate change for the country. Next slide, please. So if we go into the gaps into a more details, then we divide it into gaps in policy framework. So now when we actually went through the policies, none of the existing policy framework of the water and agricultural sector actually suggest adoption of structured water accounting system. And these policies mainly focus on the strategic objectives of water resource management. And they also say we should adopt useful decision support system. But things like water accounting are not there, which we think that should be part of the policy framework. Then there are resource gaps. So there are standards water accounting framework developed by IWMI, and there is another one developed by SIA. So all these are standardized water accounting framework, but existing practices do not follow this framework. So there is a wealth of information of water resources, but not comprehensively organized, stored, used, or shared. And like, for example, rainfall data are collected simultaneously and separately by more than one agency in Bangladesh, but the mandated agency is the meteorological department. So these gaps are there, whose data you actually use for water accounting. Next.
Dr. Gupta, sorry, may I please just ask that you maybe wrap up in the next minute?
Yeah, I will wrap up. If you go to the, so I will not go into the gaps further. So there are collaboration gaps, sustainability challenges. So next slide, please. Yeah, so these are the policies that we reviewed. I will not go into the details, but the green ones actually say there are actually two policies which say something about water accounting, and that too only on the supply side, not on the demand side. Next slide, please. So, and these are some of the potential standard water accounting frameworks that we evaluated, and based on water footprint or the flow and usage. But we feel that the IWMI's water accounting framework is the one which needs to be customized and will be appropriate for Bangladesh if we go for agricultural water management. Next, please. Yeah, so these are some of the recommendations. It's about the infrastructure and equipment, information sharing, human resource capacity building, and also we need an enabling environment to develop this water accounting system. So next slide. Yeah, so I would like to just say that this project is part of, this implementation is part of a World Bank funded project, Climate Adaptation and Resilience for South Asia, and would like to thank my team members. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gupta, for sharing that work that you did in Bangladesh. There are some questions that have come up. We will keep them for the Q&A session after the next two panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you again. So our next case study is from Fiji by Viliame Verevalu. Viliame is the principal scientific officer at the Fiji Meteorological Service and has extensive experience in Fiji in field hydrology, on-site, site installations, flood monitoring and flood warning. Viliame is responsible for leading the hydrology section of the Fiji Meteorological Service and also for providing flood warning advice for the country. Over to you, Vili.
Thank you, Lydia, and hello, everyone. Yes, I'll briefly talk about the flash flood early warning system, the system, and all the tools we use for the flood forecasting system in Fiji. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, the priority of water resource management for the Fiji Meteorological Service is the provision of flood early warning system. Next slide, please. What system are in place at FMS? Actually, there are currently two. One is the Fiji Flash Flood Guidance System that was implemented in 2019, and the river and flooding based on the threshold level. We use this system when we merged with the Fiji Meteorological Service since 2012. Next slide, please. Yes, Fiji flash flood guarding systems. The objective was to contribute towards reducing the vulnerability of the country hydrometeorological disasters, specifically to strengthen national capacity to develop timely and accurate flash flood warnings. We can see on the screen the systematic flow chart of the flash flood. There are divided into three parts. The main section of the verification. The first one is the input. These are the satellite, the estimation of rainfall from the satellite, radar, and also the observation data from our gauge stations. The second one is the land surface product. These are model soil water content over FFG, basing on using the quality control on-site measurement over several soil depths. Here, the developer used the Sacramento accounting model for the soil moisture. So the third one is the threat product and warnings. These are imminent flash flood threat, persistent flash flood threat. They are given in 1, 3, and 6 hours duration. And we also have the forecasting flash flood threat and the flash flood risk product. They are also given in 12, 24, and 36 hours period. So once we are given the FFG value, by definition is the amount of rainfall that is required to fall on a particular catchment in order for that catchment to overflow on the outlet. So the lower the value, the more concern on that particular catchment. Next slide, please. Yes, the river rain flooding based on threshold level. This is nowcasting. We take a cue from our National Weather Forecasting Center, and they issue the heavy rain or heavy rain warning and heavy rain alert. Our team will mobilize and monitor the water level on each water level station. So once it reaches or exceeds the alert level, then we issue the flood alert. Or exceed the flood warning level, then we issue the flood warning. So totally there are 29 rainfall stations within the catchment, not the whole Fiji, only within the catchment, and there are 34 water level stations. Next slide, please. On the screen, the integrated of flood and flash flood alerts and warnings. These are when we working on the bench, we use these flow charts in order to monitor them both. Actually, we do the routine monitoring, and then we monitor the heavy rain and warning. So we look at the analysis of the FFG analysis, the mean aerial precipitation, and we look at the average moisture, whether it's more than 0.5. And the FFG value, as I've already mentioned, the lower the FFG value, the more concern on that particular catchment. And we look at our forecast, the rainfall forecast using the web model. And then before issuing both warnings, the flood and flash flood, we have to online verification whether the flood is really happening on that particular catchment or not. Next slide, please. Understanding of flood risks and impact in Fiji. When we look at the flood hazard mapping on the inundated extent, current status, we have limited mapping and modeling used in Fiji. So the challenges are the hydrological data, the quality of hydrological data. So we are really working on this. And when we look at the flood exposure and vulnerability, I think the PICRAFI is working on this. This is a project by SPC on the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Assessment and Financing Initiative. Next one is the community risk awareness, local knowledge. I think the traditional knowledge and community mechanism in place for flood warning and preparedness. But we just need the time and budget to engage the stakeholders to collect all this information. On the climate change protection, we've got the global climate models, and the challenge is to incorporate this into the early flood. Next slide, please. The monitoring and forecasting of flood events in Fiji on the hydrometeorological system. At the moment, we, as already mentioned, there are 29 rainfall station operation and 34 water level station and 18 gauging stations. But we are still trying to expand the whole over Fiji to cover the whole of Fiji. And the challenge is the budget, the staff, and the station maintenance. While we are trying to install new stations, we also need to maintain the existing stations. And the rainfall forecasting, we use the weather ready and forecasting model, the web model. They are given in 3, 6, and 24 hours. These are also ingested in the flash flood. The hydrological model, there are no hydrological modeling and used by Fiji Met Service. And I've already mentioned that we are lack of quality of hydrological data, so we are moving into it. And the flood forecasting, in my previous slides, there are two systems or two tools that we are using, the flood guidance system and the river and flood. Next slide, please. So, water resource management has a critical role in disaster reduction to the prevention of flood areas. Thank you so much. Naka.
So, nagsarvalya po, Willie, for that. Again, colleagues on this session, please feel free to post any questions that you may have for the panelists, and we will get to those questions in the following Peter Sinclair's presentation after this, or his discussion on his case study. The next panelist that we have up is Peter Sinclair, who is the Water Resource Assessment and Monitoring Coordinator for the Pacific Community, who also has over 15 years experience in leading and implementing hydrology projects for both surface and groundwater over 14 countries across the Pacific. This includes the Pacific High Coast, and Peter is also SPC's representative on the Hydrology Services Panel for the Pacific Islands Meteorological Council. Vinakavalyavu, Peter.
Naka Lataya, and good afternoon, everyone, and Bulavanaka, and thank you for this opportunity to present on groundwater management during drought in Kiribati. And I'd like to acknowledge the support of the government of Kiribati, particularly Public Utility Board and the Kiribati Met Service, who have been very helpful and forthcoming with information for us to be able to present on this. So next slide, please. This is just a small video, just to give you an idea of the context of where Kiribati is and South Tarawa, and its location in the Pacific. Plane coming into the main Bonriki Water Reserve, which we'll just do a quick fly through of an animation of the Bonriki Water Reserve. The cleared space you can see just onto the left now is where the water treatment plant is. So that's the water reserve in Kiribati. I'm not sure how many people know about atoll environments, so I'm just going to give a quick 101 on an atoll and a freshwater lens in an atoll. So you can see here, it's mainly a sand carbonate island underlined by limestone, in which recharge from rainfall comes through, and because of the less dense freshwater, which sits on top of the brackish and salt water, we get a freshwater lens to develop. So yeah, so that's the sort of how a freshwater lens develops in an atoll. And you can see that people have little shallow wells which tap the top freshest part of the lens, and also we can grow crops in there, as well as production of wells, which in that middle part of the well, you can see what we call a gallery, which is a horizontal well coming out to allow more water to come into a central point, which is then pumped out further down. During droughts, when there's no recharge, or during low rainfall periods when there's no recharge, that freshwater lens thins as a result, and you can start getting brackish water coming out through the lens, through the pumps. So we don't run out of water in atolls, we just run out of fresh water. Okay, next slide, please. So just an overview of the Bonriki Water Reserve and for South Tarawa. So there's a population, and Dave showed a slide of South Tarawa before for Kiribati. The groundwater, which has been pulled out from, and this photo of the water treatment plant, is the main source of potable water for about 63,000 people from the 2020 census. The Bonriki Reserve is only 0.7 square kilometres, and we've got 22 galleries within that space, and 6 galleries to the north in a place called Water, just north. The sustainable yield from that Bonriki Water Reserve is at 1,600 kilolitres per day, okay, 1.6 megalitres per day, with an extra 300,000 litres coming through from Water. So just under 2 megalitres or 1,900 kilolitres per day is the estimated sustainable yield. Losses in the system can account up to about, so where it's pumping out from that treatment plant there, down to South Tarawa residents, up to 70%. So you can see we've got a major issue in regards to that. We manage this system on water quality. So it's really about trying to maintain fresh, suitable water, and there's a threshold of about 1,500 microsiemens per centimetre, which is the EC salinity, of which above that we don't want to exceed. Generally, it runs around about 700 or so, and just give you a scale, 50,000 is seawater, and anything above 2,500 is considered not fresh water and brackish, and you start tasting salt in water, so around about 1,100. So just give you an idea. Current extraction at the moment is, I think, around about 1,700 kilolitres, and the EC range is about 1,175. Next slide, please. This is a schematic of the galleries. So you can see the red, yellow, green, blue. They're the pipelines connecting the galleries. The galleries are numbered like from 1 to 22 here, and you can see the arms of those galleries overlain on top of the surface. So they go out, they extend about 100 metres out in each direction to access that groundwater. As I said, up in the top right, there's the water site, which is just to the north, and it's got 6 galleries in there. About 2 years ago, we installed some salinity meters in each of those galleries in the Bonriki Water Reserve, and connected the flow meters to a telemetry system. So we're able to actually get hourly readings of what the flow rate is, whether the pump's on, and what the salinity is. So this is really useful information for us to understand how the system's operating in the freshwater lands. Okay. Next slide, please. So what's happening at the moment? Okay, so the last 2 years we've gone into drought. And you can see this with the orange indicate the average monthly rainfall that Kiribati should be receiving. And you can see since about April 2020 right through now, we've got below average. That's the blue columns there showing well below average. That gives you the seasonality associated with it. So we've had for about 2 years low rainfall, below average rainfall in Kiribati. And what we're looking at now is what's happening to the lens. Can we go to the next slide, please? What we've done here is looking at meteorological drought. So one of the parameters that we consider is, of course, meteorological drought and the impact of that meteorological drought on the water resource. Now, this, just to give you an idea, what it's really saying is that this is the current drought which we're in, which is on the far right. You can see it shows a series of droughts, is the third worst drought over the record period. The worst drought was back in 1998, which went for 37 months. This current drought is going for about 14 or 15 months at the moment. And we've got a forecast that is going to continue to stay dry for at least through till probably November, which is when they start to get a more wetter season. But at this stage, because it's a La Nina situation, that for Kiribati means a low rainfall. Okay, so that gives you an idea of that we're in a meteorological drought for the moment. Next slide, please. So how we're managing this groundwater, so the water is being pumped out. So on average, you can see, well, the graph there shows the blue line is the daily abstraction that's coming out of the system. So you can see it's around, varies, but it goes, you know, it's around 1,700 kilolitres of water coming out per day. And that's, and then it's just suddenly slightly dropped. Now the orange line is the salinity that's been happening since that time. And you can see with the current abstraction and that dry rainfall period that you saw before, you can see the salinity that's leaving the treatment plant is now up around 1,100, 1,200 microsiemens per centimetre. It started off around about 700 before this, the beginning of this drought. At the moment, they're pulling out about 1,700 kilolitres of water per day. And as I said, the salinity is in the order of around about 1,200. The maximum daily was 1,200. And it's currently around 1,700. Okay. So that's the data trends over the last 3 months. So we're getting this information. It's from all the galleries and also the water treatment plant, which gives us a really good insight into how the lens is behaving under these drought conditions. So just the next slide, please. So just to re-emphasize this, you can see what the Bonriki water reserve status was back in May 2021. The yellow stars indicate that a salinity from those individual galleries was around 1,000 to 1,300 microsiemens. And the red stars were those which were above 1,300 microsiemens. So that was just over a year ago. You can see we've got a few galleries we were talking to Kiribati about, and they were, you know, we better keep an eye on this. So can we go to the next slide, please? And that's the situation in May this year. So 12 months on, you can see that only 3 galleries are actually below 1,000 microsiemens, which is normally what the system would be normally running at. And quite a few more are above the 1,000 to 1,300, and certainly, and we've even got galleries which are above 2,000 microsiemens. There's about 3 of them which are above 2,000. Next slide, please. So those are the ones indicated there in the red. So those ones, we, according to what the modelling that's been done, would suggest that we should be turning those galleries off, reducing the water supply from them. because they're now starting to pump brackish water, which is not helping the water quality going down to the residents of South Tarawa. Next slide, please. So looking at the salinity trend from the water treatment plant from February this year through till yesterday, you can see this is the daily salinity trends going up. And if you just look at a line of best fit through there, it would suggest that we'll breach our threshold value of 1500 towards the end of November. So at the current state, that's where it would go. Now, when we get rain, and the last few days or last 5 or so days, they've had rain up in Kiribati, and you can see that there's been a slight freshening of the lens in response to that. But that will quickly turn around if they don't have any additional rain. So because that freshness is just a freshening of the lens a little bit, but it won't stay for very long from us. So every time you see a little drop, it means that it's probably corresponding with rainfall through there. Okay, so yeah, the concern is that I guess in the next 23 weeks or so, we'll have breached what was the agreed value of the salinity. And because the salinity is now around about 1200, 1150, 1200, people are already tasting, can taste the difference in the water that they normally get through there. All right, next slide, please.
Pete, if I could just please ask you to wrap up in the next minute.
All right, okay. Well, look, what I'll do is So look, this is just some indications around what we use for the alerts, and basically it's saying that it's rainfall which is below, salinity which is above 1000, and an outlook which is associated with below average rainfall. Next slide, please. The drought plan actually has a whole series of criteria or prescriptive criteria which allows the NDMO to be able to advise when and whether it should be in a drought and some of the responses associated with it. Next slide, please. So it's just a schematic they use through there. The drought response plan, which is what we're in there, also has a whole list of responses which may be relevant, which can be introduced. So this is a list that they can draw upon. And I guess the main ones is that they need to introduce restrictions. That means that to reduce those losses, they might turn off the water moving into the community areas and put standpipes in to control that loss of water, reduce the hours of water supply, and also, of course, go to alternative water sources. And that's some of the issues that they're looking at the moment. Okay, thank you very much.
Nakavalevu, Pete, for sharing us some of the work in Kiribati around the drought planning for Tarawa. I'm pleased that we're going to actually switch back to a Q&A session with all our panelists, and I see that there have been some questions posted in the Q&A. Thank you for these. So there was a specific one for Dr. Gupta, pardon me. And just for those of you who are actually tracking this, some of the Q&A, some of the questions have been answered. So please feel free to go through there. Dr. Gupta, a question here was, does the water accounting framework you refer to include water for wash along with irrigation and industries? And how are the key national partners actually involved?
Thank you, Lydia, for the question and the question from the audience. Actually, honestly speaking, that framework that we are planning to adopt just have the agricultural water management as the key one. It doesn't have the wash sector. So that's why the customization is required. And in fact, we are in conversation with the EME to co-develop this. But besides that, as I said, for integration purposes, we are co-developing the approach with WARPO, our main partner, and other agricultural institutions who are supporting with knowledge and data. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You'd made a comment around, you can't manage what you don't measure. That's an adage that's actually used quite broadly across the water resources discipline and a challenge at that.
Yeah, I could get your question. Sorry.
No, it was just a comment based on your presentation. Yes.
Yeah.
So this was a question to Pete on the Bonriki water reserve. Aside from weather trends, are you also considering tidal impacts on the ground monitoring network? What are you actually capturing, and how are these impacts from tidal events addressed? And I'm guessing this means inundation as well, Pete.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Lato. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, as the tide comes up and down, the freshwater lens also comes up and down with it. So you can see the variations. We capture that in the galleries when we go, when there's granularity associated with, the different salinity we're measuring at different times of the day. So yes, that tidal stuff is caught into it, and I guess in terms of inundation impacts, if we get storm surges and so on that come across, if that does, we do get ingress of salt water across into the lens, and we've done some modelling around this. What happens is that obviously you get a salt slug that just goes straight into the ground on top of that freshwater lens. It takes some time, even though it's heavier, it's more dense, it takes some time for it to move through the freshwater lens, and you really need recharge to speed that up. And I should add, to recover these freshwater lenses after drought can take, between 2 to 6 years, depending on how long the rain or how much rainfall you get. So it's all rainfall dependent. They do recover. That's the other good thing about it. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Pete. Vili, I have a question for you. And thank you for your honesty around some of the capacity challenges that you're facing. How are you meeting some of those capacity constraints at the moment?
Okay, thank you. As I've already mentioned so many times during my presentation on the lack of this quality hydrological data. We are moving into this space. We are trying to improve our rating curve, establish our rating curve for these 18 gauging stations, and then follow up from there. We need to get the automatic transmission of the flow data. So that will gonna help us in our stream flow measurement that will be used for the hydrological model. First, we need to have data first, then we look for what model we are to use during the plant forecast.
Thank you, Vili. And then and I guess a follow up to that would be, early warning, is probably not just the responsibility of the Met services, the meteorological and hydrological services. That there's a component around, preparedness and response. And how are you doing that in Fiji?
Yeah, mostly on the response part of it, we are liaising with the communities on how well our warnings reach them before the events happen. Yeah? That is one of the response, online verification before we issue the warning, especially for the floods. I mentioned during my presentation on the before we issue the flash flood warning, we need to verify first on the ground. It's both the subjective and objective use of the product of the FFGS and also our local knowledge and the online verification to those places who are about to receive these events, the flood events.
So, thank you so much to our three panelists with the presentation of their 3 case studies. I'm sure there's going to be a couple of more questions that are raised throughout the course of this session and maybe even afterwards. I see that there's already a request for recordings for the session. Thank you once again. And, I'm sure that this is the start of some sharing across the region around this around this. So I have the joy of also keeping track of time, so I'm not going to talk anymore. I really want to grow from the case studies, the work that water resources management, how for response and recovery to water-mediated disasters. And if you recall from Dave's presentation, this is the second component of the work. First up, we have a case study from Fiji by Anita Mata with the Fiji Mineral Resources Department. And, Annie's been working with the Mineral Resources Department hydrogeology unit, for nearly 10 years. The hydrogeology unit is effectively responsible for groundwater resources for the country, including its monitoring, management, and protection. Over to you, Annie.
Bolavenaka to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to the department. Basically, as you can see on the slide, it's about a story in the village of Yaro in Fiji. Yaro is located on Kia Island in the northern division of Fiji, and it's one of the villages because it consists of Kia Island consists of 3 villages, and one of them is Yaro. So the village of Yaro had suffered adverse and severe damages to the homes and plantations following the severe tropical cyclone Yasa in December 2020. So part of the quick response to the cyclone was to identify and evaluate the quantity and quality of the groundwater source on the island of Kia in order to provide a clean and safe potable drinking water source for the village. So through that, the Mineral Resource Department, in collaboration with the Water Resources Assessment Unit, SPC, the following were conducted: a detailed groundwater investigation using an electric resistivity machine in order to identify potential targets for drilling. So following to that, the Mineral Resource Department continued with groundwater drilling and development, and also the reticulation system was conducted for the borehole in order for the water source to reach households. The work was attended from February to April 2021. The groundwater project was a successful one. It was proven sufficient for the villages of Yaro that the yield of the groundwater volumes and it's been potable, safe, and clean drinking water in the long run. We will now go on to a video.
We have a well that the first settlers of Yaro have been drinking from. They do washing, they bath from there, and they also carry water to their house. They use a bucket and then they draw water from the well. They fill up a plastic gallon, about 20 liters. We saw water tanks flowing above our heads, above the house that we were in. We saw blocks, even iron roofs came, a piece of iron roof came right into the room that we were in.
Mana vi dangi lamba kevi. Untuk rumah kaya sangga itu ngarongan ni laga kena dua si ruana vale. Kau mai tataran na rebu ne yasa ko rusa bulkaon na vale. Wilkina rona nitu ibe question sa ko ronda butungo. Na ban lotu kena nitu village hall. Ko romenda talaga na na dangilang boyas. Na maroi babinaw na ngona ya tara na singa bukelulu ke na singa pakarawai. Ero na singa era unda kina na tani nuengo merani marro tumanda maina ngauna ono na bula. Nani mami I lega tua wai ena ngona the kimem ken na dangila.
The whole program was run by MRD and the Fiji government as part of disaster response after Cyclone Yasa, and the source was a result of a combined investigation that was done by the two organizations, Mineral Resources Department and SPC's Water Resource Assessment Team, that led to the identification of this particular source that was then drilled by MRD's drilling team for the community's water supply.
When we found water, everyone in the village came here to the site just to witness the water running from the bore when we were airlifting. Yeah, they were really happy about it, but we were the most happiest trying to find, being able to find water for the people of Yarrow.
When we talk about resilience, we are hoping that through all these interventions, we are able to put up the systems that are required that could help the communities to withstand the impacts of disasters that could be worse than Cyclone Yasa. Knowing that water is the human right, it's very important for human survival. Having that particular source of life available during a disaster is a source of hope. Even if they are waiting for other help or assistance for food and other things.
So na bibina kaya mayad. Dua na bisau mayad o golonga sarangan ng bulararamban ni matay saramantanga na buvale no nangandre na wai. Na kenikarua vera na ni mami ngone budi. Liwer da umbera. Nani mami dolawai na mami dolawai mena toevo kau mai mera mai silivale nangonongo satu na bisau saya na bisau satu tola ne mami ngone buli ure ne mami marama sa sule birendo na vadi ngulevu ni rasa sili ngai bale ra pangata kana wai bale pasa ngai bale ndo talango na bibisau ni kambale na tiko mbula dogo kena bangata na wai na balai iliu ke mem sadau bangata katuna na pit toilet kongo sara flash tuna sabakanga da tumai taun lambas na bibisau ko kota mai na kena sa ke mem na bibu ke lem kona.
It has made life much easier because my kids are still small. None of them can carry water for me. Now I have a tap right in front of my house. Life is so much easier.
Naka, as you can see on the video, the joy shown on the community's face with the groundwater resource that has been discovered on the island. On the other hand, most importantly, is the continuation in the managing and monitoring of the resource. there had been recommendations and instructions for the use of the borehole relayed to the community that it is strictly followed for the safekeeping of the groundwater source, which is most paramount for the villager community. Also, in relation to the groundwater project, a water supply management plan survey was conducted, and the aim for the survey is for the community in order for the improved water supply systems in the village, and to ensure that all the available water sources are continually used. They don't depend mainly on the borehole alone. Also in the usage of the existing water sources, and the community were empowered on the safe use of water sources in order to meet the demand of the population. Capacity building and community involvement on the appropriate developed system so that it is sustained and well maintained. Also, risks are identified and categorized and mitigated through advice and solutions. And lastly, it is strictly guaranteed that the resource construction and operation is monitored and maintained and protected by the water community and the community as a whole.
Ani, for that. It was indeed a joy to see the faces on people's, to see faces delighted with having access to water, particularly after a devastation caused by the cyclone. On the next suite of case studies that we'll be learning from this afternoon, we have Ben Famage, who is the CEO of Water Sensitive Cities in Australia. Water Sensitive Cities Australia, a research to practice initiative located within Monash University. Ben has more than 25 years of experience in the Australian and international water sector, and prior to joining the CRC for Water Sensitive Cities in 2017 and establishing the Water Sensitive Cities Australia Ben has worked as a regulator, a policymaker, and water service provider. During his 10 years as a general manager at Melbourne Water, Ben's leadership responsibilities included water resource planning, pricing and regulation, public affairs, research and development. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Latia, and hello everyone. Greetings from Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne, Australia. Today I'd like to talk to you about the value that nature-based solutions can bring as we prepare for, respond to and recover from water-related disasters. Next slide, please. In particular, I'd like to highlight that nature-based solutions can offer a really broad range of values at a broad range of scales. And here's some examples. You can see at a really small scale, nature-based solutions, even things like passively irrigated trees, or integrating green into our walls and our roofs and even our urban furniture, can provide water detention and water quality benefits, but also provide benefits in terms of reducing the impacts of extreme heat and creating great livable spaces where people want to come and spend time with their family and their friends and build those social connections that are so important in terms of social resilience to extreme events, but also encourage economic activity as well, because we know that the stronger our social connections, the stronger our economy, the better the shape of our environment going into a disaster, the greater our capacity to recover and respond. And nature-based solutions can do that at a really small scale. They can do it at a precinct scale. And down in the left, bottom left corner, you can see a cross-section from the approach being adopted in one of the locations for the Revitalising Informal Settlements in their Environments project, the RISE project. And here you can see nature and technology, or nature and structure, working well together. Natural processes like surface and subsurface wetlands working together with technology like pumped sewers, pressure sewers. And looking at another scale, at an even bigger scale on the right-hand side, you can see where nature and structure are working together in the city of Kunshan, China. And this is a project that we worked on recently. It's about 50 kilometers northwest of Shanghai in China. And what started out as a big road, just focusing on transporting people, a big grey solution, had a green and a blue component added. Blue providing transport of water, green providing treatment of that water every day and improving its quality so that it can be returned to the blue and used downstream for agriculture, but also providing a great space where people can come and exercise and build those social connections, that social connectivity. And so you've got green, grey and blue working together at a city scale, as part of a multifunctional corridor. So you can see lots of options in terms of the potential contribution of nature-based solutions. If we could have the next slide, please. But wherever we work in the world, the first thing people tell us is that our place is unique, our issues are different. And so how do we value, compare and identify the right mix of nature-based solutions and structural and community-based responses for that particular location? And can we come up with a mix of measures that are available to us to do work in extreme events like floods and droughts, but also can they add value every day? And as well as bringing together good community engagement, science and good engineering, can we bring the economics to the discussion to build the business case for action so that we can secure our financing to build it and our ongoing funding streams to maintain it, so that it is operated and maintained in a way that delivers value every day, but is also ready to go when we need it to respond for an extreme event. This was the challenge that we set ourselves through in our integrated urban flood management project. Next slide, please. And the project adopted, it's been through a number of iterations, applied in a number of different countries, and it adopts a 5-step process. First of all, even though we're talking about urban settlements, cities and large towns, they sit within a catchment, and you can't think about a city without thinking about its broader basin, its broader catchment. And so understand the urban context from a economic, a social and an environmental point of view. What are the key issues and priorities? And then, because we were thinking about flood-related issues initially, what is the impact of flooding, fluvial, pluvial, coastal, groundwater? How does that all impact on those broader city and basin scale objectives? And then how do we think broadly in terms of the full range of nature-based solutions, but also working in partnership with large concrete and steel structures, as well as really effective community engagement and activation as well through things like early warning systems, planning codes, or even economic incentives? How do we value those different options and bring them together in an economically rigorous way so that we can build our case to get it financed and funded? And then once we understand what we want to do, can we look at the distribution of costs and benefits? Because when we understand who benefits and who incurs the costs, we can potentially have a good conversation about who should pay, how and when. Can I have the next slide, please? So the first stage of this work looked at 2 locations in China, as well as 2 hypothetical cases based on our experience in Australia, and that was funded through the World Bank. And then with the support of the Australian Water Partnership, we were able to look at the application of this 5-step process to 4 cities in Thailand and Thailand and Vietnam. 2 big cities, Bangkok and Ho Chi Minh City, highlighting that you can do nature-based solutions really well in really high density, very big cities, but also looking at 2 regional locations, Rayong City at the end of the Eastern Economic Corridor in Thailand, and the island of Phu Quoc, looking at a self-contained system, an island, which was a great opportunity. And a key part of all of this work was really good engagement with our colleagues in country, so that the international team were able to bring a broad range of experience and options, a broad toolkit from our experience around the world, but the selection of the right mix for that particular location was driven by a deep understanding and the expertise of the people that actually live there. As I said, 4 case studies were completed. We used the tools developed through the 9-year, $120 million Australian Cooperative Research Centre for Water Sensitive Cities. So those tools were taken and adapted to a Mekong context. And then the results of all of that work was presented at a regional conference, bringing in our colleagues from Thailand and Vietnam, but also inviting in colleagues from Cambodia and Laos as well. Because even though each of our contexts and our cities are very different, we have a number of shared significant challenges as a result of climate change and population growth. And so how do we work together to share our experience? That was really the aim of that conference. You can see a QR code and a link to each of the case studies and a recording of the conference for further information if you're interested. Next slide. And before I go, I'll just illustrate the sorts of thinking that we applied through this project to the island of Phu Quoc, the biggest island in Vietnam, a beautiful location where its natural beauty has meant that its tourism industry has grown rapidly, as has its economy, but its infrastructure and its environment have struggled to keep up with that rapid rate of growth. So can we use good combinations of nature, culture and structure, people, plants in concrete and steel all coming together to come up with a good way forward? And the work that we did was to compare a more traditional big infrastructure solution downstream to address flooding, broadening and deepening a river downstream to address the flooding in that area, with an upstream intervention, a multifunctional retarding basin that provide, and you can see from the picture there, the swamp forest and the economic and the tourism opportunities created by that location delivered value every day, but it was also available to hold back and detain the flooding flows when it was needed in those extreme events. So a multifunctional asset that was delivering value upstream and benefits downstream, both day to day and during extreme events. Next slide, please. And as well as bringing in the science and the engineers, we also brought in the economists and the economic tools to start to build the economic business case to get this sort of work financed and funded. And you can see there that the outputs of some of that analysis, the pie chart shows the broad range of benefits that were identified through the multifunctional retarding basin at the top of the catchment. And you can see that the biggest wedge was downstream flood protection. So flood protection was still the largest benefit provided by this investment, but you can also see a range of other benefits that delivered as well. Things like infrastructure savings, extra tourism, improved environmental and amenity outcomes, all coming together to increase the value generated for the community from this really important asset. And as well as looking at the total benefits and the total costs, we also looked at the distribution of those costs and amongst different groups, different locations, and over time as well. Because when we understand who benefits, we can also have a good conversation about how do we actually fund and finance the activity so that the resources are there to make sure that it works every day and when we need it in an extreme event. Thank you. Next slide. So that's just a quick introduction to our Integrated Urban Flood Management project. And hopefully it provides a good illustration of how nature-based solutions can work at different scales, and we can bring together nature, structure and culture to come up with a solution set that meets the needs of each individual location. We can do it in a way that adds value every day, but also is there for extreme events when we need it. And as well as bringing in the engineering and the science, we can also bring in the economics so that it has the funding that it needs to be maintained and operated in a way that fully realises the benefits every day, but also make sure that it is available and operational when we have an extreme event. Thank you for your attention, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that. Quite interesting to see the value add of using nature-based solution approach in some of the benefits that you presented. Our last and final case study is going to be presented by David Winfield from Alluvium. David is a water and river basin specialist with over 20 years of experience in water, environment, and natural resources issues in Australia and internationally. David has played a leading role advising on water policy, river basin planning, evaluation, and reporting projects for New South Wales, Victoria, the Australian Capital Territory, and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, as well as internationally. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much. Great to see so many people joining from across the globe today, and great to be with you. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, the capital city of Australia. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about Alluvium, the co-sponsor of this session, an Australian employee-owned company specialising in science, engineering, policy and strategy for water catchments, rivers and coasts, and with a group of companies working across the social, economic and ecological sectors, and the whole group working internationally as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk today about river basin planning and some guidance we developed with some partners for the Australian Water Partnership. What is river basin planning? Well, it is about managing a river basin as a whole. It's about holistic water resource management. It's about choosing from a range of tools for sustainable management. What tool is fit for purpose in each different situation? It's about an integrated approach across sectors, across communities, and indeed across boundaries, whether they be provincial or state boundaries or international boundaries. It is important in river basin planning to recognise and respect the legal and administrative boundaries that are there and the roles that different governments and regions play, while trying to work with those structures to manage the water resource as a whole. It's also about recognising there's a range of parties who are impacted by water resource management or who are beneficiaries of water resource management. And I do emphasise that whilst I'm talking about river basin planning and surface water here, many of the same principles will of course apply to managing groundwater basins and aquifers. Next slide, please. Why is river basin planning important? Well, of course, it is about managing water resources, and water is the centre of life. It's a critical human need. Managing water resources for domestic needs, urban needs, agriculture, industry, power, energy, and so forth. As we move into a changing climate, we see across many regions an increase in drought conditions, but also with an increase in storm intensity, an increase in floods as well. And we see the impact of these conditions on ecosystems and indeed on the ecosystem services that humans benefit from. And there's a picture there from an Australian example of a fish kill caused by a lack of water flow due to drought, and some other issues around water management. And these impact on our livelihoods. Next slide, please. So river basin planning is part of the solution, and it is about a collection of tools. Obviously, we have technical tools and technical expertise and skills that we apply to the problem, scientific expertise and skills, policy expertise and skills. But importantly, river basin planning is also about people working together, whether it's individuals working together across those disciplines, between governments, and indeed across nations in international basins. So a lot of the skills and experience that's needed in this space is about working with people as much as the specific or technical skills. And those skills are applied to solve problems, to negotiate trade-offs. If one party is winning over here, if one party is being impacted over here, then maybe another party can give here, those sorts of negotiations. Importantly, it's about making decisions and who has the authority to make decisions, and we'll go into that in a minute. And it's about the implementation of those decisions with accountability for the parties responsible. It requires good governance, but it does work in the context, the different context of each country and each river basin. You always start where you are. You start with your existing institutions, your existing arrangements, and you have to develop from that. It's very rare that you start with a blank sheet of paper. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Alluvium with partners University of Technology Sydney and Access Water Management developed river basin planning guidance for India as well as for the Indo-Pacific region. And I'll be talking to the guidance basin guide for the Australian Water Partnership today. There are other guidance documents out there. For example, there's one there from the Asian Development Bank. But there's a range of guidelines about river basin planning, all bring a slightly different perspective. And this is a perspective here drawn from Australian experience, but also from experts from across the Indo-Pacific region that we gathered in a workshop. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk through this cycle that you can see in front of you, an adaptive planning cycle. I guess one of the key things about it is that you could start at any point in this cycle, and the steps in the cycle are conceptual steps, but they may well overlap. They may not necessarily be in sequence, but these are the aspects that we felt were important in developing a river basin plan, or indeed any adaptive water management framework, including for disaster resilience. So initiation is the start of the process. How do we get started? What do we do to get started? One of the most important things is to understand why you're doing it. It might sound fairly obvious, but it's important to identify what are the priority issues, not to overreach and try and achieve too much at once, but also to get a common understanding amongst stakeholders about what those priority issues are. It's very important to build a network of support and leadership across sectors, across governments, across political actors and leaders, and indeed to get those parties on board in providing leadership for the process. Another important part of initiating the process is developing a vision and objectives, and we'll come back to those later when we start to look at monitoring and evaluation. We've got it as the second stage, but it's in the middle of the diagram there, the big red circle, ongoing engagement. In the middle because it's important to every single stage of river basin planning. Engagement with stakeholders and community. As I said, river basin planning is about people. It's about people's activities. It's about people's well-being and their livelihood. Critical human water needs, but also economic water needs and ecological water needs and social water needs. It's important to identify all the stakeholder groups, develop a stakeholder engagement plan. Different stakeholder groups may require different methods of engagement. It's important to share information. If you're to build a plan that is agreed and supported by a wide range of groups and likely to be enduring, then there is a need to share information openly and for all parties to have access to that. As I mentioned, leadership and support is important as well. Governance was our third aspect. Who makes decisions and who is responsible? And so it's important to establish enabling governance, policy and legislation. This is another area where you always start where you are. You have existing institutions, existing legislation, existing arrangements, which will differ according to culture, according to nation, according to geographic area and river basin. But it's important to identify what are those institutional arrangements. Do you need to enable specific arrangements for river basin planning? How will you provide transparency and accountability and openness so that all stakeholders feel involved in the decision-making process? How do you begin a dialogue and agree on the forum and the process for decision-making? Who will make those decisions? How will they make them? When will they make them? And so forth. It may be the river basin organisation is important to take the process forward. That's the pathway we took in the Murray-Darling Basin, which I'll talk about a little bit further in Australia. But a river basin organisation certainly has a range of advantages in being able to look across the whole basin. But there are a range of different approaches there. Next is a situation assessment. Where are we now? A collection of data, science, knowledge, and technical understanding of where the river basin is at. It is obviously about hydrology and hydraulics, but it's also about the ecology of the river basin, the social context of the river basin, the population, the water needs, and the economy, and how those water availability and water need oscillates over time. Water modelling will be an important part of that situation assessment, but it is important to emphasise that you don't have to have all of the information, all the modelling, all the science. If you wait until you've got all that, you could be waiting a long time. You can get started with the information that you have, or with very little information. It's important to get started. So planning, the obviously critical aspect of river basin planning. And so I'll go to the next slide, please.
Sorry, David, if I could just get you to maybe spend a minute to just wrap up.
Certainly will. Thank you, Litea. Yes, planning is about considering strategies, options, negotiating trade-offs, making decisions, and involving stakeholders in those decisions. Implementation, very important. Too many plans are made and sit on the shelf, so it's important to implement good accountability and processes to ensure that the plan is implemented, and then monitoring, evaluation, reporting and review and improvement is an important part of the cycle. So if I could just go please to slide 12. Next slide. Thank you. And we'll just have to skip over that. Thank you very much. And next slide. Thank you. I'll just give an example from in Australia. We had a large degree of stakeholder engagement after some early mistakes, and we now have a strong community involvement in planning. It occurs at a range of scales across our federal system. Next slide, please. But this one, next slide, please. Thank you. This example, and I won't talk to the detail, but really the principle is that you can apply these approaches at a village scale, as we've seen in some of the examples today. This one was an example of a village in India, which took an integrated approach to groundwater management. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, river basin planning can be applied at a range of scales. The principles can be applied at a local scale. It's important to consider the context, identify those key areas of need and the entry points into the planning process. The stages and guiding questions, key actions and outcomes are all set out in this basin guide, and it's available at the web address you can see there. Thank you. Next slide. And thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for that, David. You know, it would be interesting to see if there's further questions to you during this Q&A session with your other panelists. The first question I had was actually for Annie, and it was a question around who actually monitors the water resource in Yarrow.
The monitoring work, unless the department receives an issue from the community, and it is attended by the department. If not, it has been the water supply management plan that was conducted. It's been with the community themselves, the water committee in the community, for them to conduct monitoring, and if they have any issues, then they refer to the department.
Thank you for that, Nani. Just trying to see if there's some other questions for either Ben or maybe I'll have a question to either Ben or David. Has water resources management and nature-based solutions actually come together organically in the last maybe in the last 10 years? Is that happening a lot more now that those considerations are now taking place? Maybe to you first, Ben, and then to David.
Yeah, thanks, Lutia. I think there's broad recognition of the value that nature-based solutions can bring now. So people understand the theory and the potential, and there's more and more strategies that are being identified that include nature-based solutions, but moving from theory to practice and moving from pilot scale to scale at large, and making sure that we have the funding and financing to be able to deliver and maintain our projects. That's the next challenge for many locations. So I think we're clearer now on the potential. It's the practice, the enabling regulation, legislation, community support, and technical capacity is growing. But how do we move from pilot and demonstration to business as usual application in practice?
Thanks for that, Ben. David?
Yeah, thank you. My response would be at a completely different scale, I guess. You know, we've worked at this large scale at the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. We've been working on delivering water to ecosystems across the basin, on restoring those ecosystems. We've reset the balance between irrigation and ecosystem water, you know, wetlands that were fed by the river system. So we've been looking at it in that context. I guess that, you know, one of the key aspects of this is trying to develop a system whereby you accept that you have impacted the system, that you're trying to restore nature, but you're not sort of looking at a completely separate system from human activity. You're trying to look at an integrated system, set clear objectives, and then manage to those.
Thanks for that. Ben, there's a question here. Did the Integrated Urban Flood Management Nature-Based Solutions Project make use of the IUC and global standard on nature-based solutions in order to validate the work, you know, that was actually in line with that? Thank you.
Great question. The short answer is no. But we certainly could. And I think what we're doing with this work is applying it to more and more very different locations. So, you know, we've got one island identified now. It'd be great to start to apply it to other locations and maybe to smaller settlements as well. So that would certainly be something that we would certainly consider as a future stage of this work.
Thanks for that, Ben. And for you, David, with the over 48 First Nations across the Murray-Darling Basin, how was engagement done?
Thank you. Yes, look, this is an area Australia is still trying to improve, I've got to say. There is, so across, there are that many nations across the Murray-Darling Basin. There is a couple of committees, I suppose, through which engagement with First Nations occurs, as well as a kind of a travelling around to meet face-to-face with the nations. But importantly, the chair of the Basin Community Committee is a Gomeroi man, Phil Duncan, and there are one or two other Indigenous members on that Basin Community Committee, as well as the specific First Nations committees as well. So a range of structures to get that engagement, but a long way to go, that's for sure.
So level to our three panelists for this afternoon, for sharing your experiences, the work. Quite exciting, I must say. Something that we should probably look up on. I mean, given the number of publications that are already available online, it would be a shame to not reflect and to look at these in terms of how they could be applied across the various areas that we're working in. Good luck again. Thank you. And at this time, I'm actually going to hand over to the session facilitators to continue. Everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for such a rich discussion. Three of us now will just do a quick summary, and I'll start by handing over to Simon. I'll fill in the middle, and then we'll close with Dave from the Fiji Hub.
Thanks, Rowan. So I'm Simon Tilliard from Alluvium. We're an environmental and social consulting organisation working both in Australia, but also across Asia and into the Pacific. As Rowan's just mentioned, we get the opportunity to just say some closing words along with Rowan and from Dave. Firstly, thanks to Latea for moderating the session. It's been fantastic to have such deep insights from your experience around risk reduction in the Pacific. And I think as we've learned through a few presentations today, those insights are not just relevant for the Pacific, but more broadly across many of the countries that the participants and the people listening in today are from. So thanks Latea. Thanks also to co-conveners, Australian Water Partnership and SBC, and to our 6 fantastic speakers. I think the broad experience of the co-conveners and the speakers means that this session has been able to explore a pretty broad range of how WRM's role, or water resources management role, in mitigating water-mediated disasters can occur. We've covered from the prevention and the planning to the response and the recovery. We've covered from the Pacific and Kiribati and Fiji into Asia with Bangladesh and the Mekong. We've covered disasters related to too much water, not enough water. We've covered high-level interventions, so basin planning and water accounting, as well as on-the-ground interventions, so the groundwater supply in Yarra Village, the putting in of a bore well. And we've covered a range of technical responses from modelling, monitoring, planning, and economics. So a broad range of ground has been covered, and it's kind of hard in such a rich session to try and identify some key takeaways from it. But my probably 2 key ones are, one is disasters undermine sustainable development. And so we really need to be considering how we respond to disasters across all our development actions, whether it's water resources management, urban planning, or any other part of sustainable development. The second is the issues are complex. This leads to the points of the prevention cycle, the prevention, planning, response and recovery, often being managed quite separately. But I think as several of the case studies have shown today, water resources management provides an opportunity to start integrating between those different actions a lot better. So connecting those points of the risk reduction cycle a lot more cleanly. So thanks for that. I'll pass back to Rowan and then to Dave for some final words.
Great, thank you. Look, I think, you know, from Colombia to India, from the United States to Samoa, it's such a rich array of people and experiences. I think there's about 143, 144 or so on the chat. So thank you for making it to the session. I can only appreciate the time difference in some of the countries. I think one of the things that this topic has in common with all of us is that disasters affect us all in some way at some point in time. Here in Australia, we're hopefully coming towards the back end of some quite serious flooding and in previous couple of years, the fires as well. So we're definitely not immune. And sometimes people think of us as quite a sort of developed country. But one of the things that's really struck me through this presentation is that it's the supporting of the capacity of the local communities in the preparedness or the prevention, the preparedness, response and recovery, which is something we really must keep at the forefront of our thinking. The other consideration, I think, is the accessibility to these systems, this new way of thinking, making sure the science is accessible, it's translatable, and it's able to be utilized, not just sort of you know, kept at the higher level. It's got to be accessible for local communities and those people that really need it. And I think that's key across all sectors. And we must strive as a disaster community, as a water community, to make sure that accessibility is key. It's not the 90% of people that we're supporting, it's the 10% that we can't see that often are the ones that are the most vulnerable in the disaster cycle. Just a couple of quick points as well. I think, you know, the nature-based solutions, it struck me that it doesn't have to be large scale. We often think large scale, I think, and I thought it was really great to really just see the variant in scale. And the psychosocial perspectives can't be underestimated in disaster management. And, you know, I think the ecological support and the ecological management can't be underestimated as well. So it was great to see that sort of coming through. The other consideration is, I think it's as I think Dave said, you always start where you are. I'd almost like to add, but you must reach the end altogether. So it's about bringing along people for the journey and making sure that they're able to understand and access it. The one thing that really struck me though was I do wonder whether we need to start thinking about altering or adapting the disaster management architecture. We have the WASH cluster in the UN system. Maybe we need to be really starting to drive a resource management cluster as well, or something alike, because I think this, for me, coming into this sector recently, from the humanitarian side of things, this is a sector which stretches across all sectors, and whether there's an opportunity now to start to rethink how the humanitarian or disaster management architecture supports resource management, in particular water resource management, might be something to consider going forward. So in closing, thank you very much for the co-conveners from Alluvium and also the Pacific community, and especially all of those speakers today. You've enriched us and you've enlightened us all. So thank you very much for your time.
Hey, thanks, Rowan. So I think we're over time. So very quickly, some very quick snapshots from here at the Fiji Hub on each of the speakers, some takeaways. Dr. Gupta, starting with you, many stakeholders in your process and just one part of the water cycle, amazing. But the message that climate-informed decision-making is critical for all of those stakeholders. Billy talked about early warning systems in Fiji, really highlighting the value of getting behind some capacity development in that area. So the gains that can be made in that area was really clear. Peter talked about how the right information in the right form at the right time can be really critical for decision makers, such as on the ground in Tarawa. Ani, you talked a great example of how water resources is really managed at a community level throughout much of the Pacific. A great example of how supporting the community in key areas can lead to really good outcomes for resilience. Ben, the key takeaway I had from you was bringing together nature, structure and culture, and the outcomes that can have in peacetime, but as well as in times of extreme events. And finally, Dave Winfield, talking about river basin management, not something you do and forget about. It's an ongoing thing of engagement, and really important that once you start it, you're really committed to a long-term partnership process. The final snapshot I actually got was from Latea. Thank you very much for your moderation today. One thing you said was about that there's no single real entry point or single connection point between water resources management and disaster risk reduction. There are many, and many of them we illustrated today. So there's so many opportunities for us to be able to get together and further strengthen those links and strengthen resilience through water resources management. And I'll just finally note that this is the discussion today is not a one-off. This is part of a broader, longer dialogue, and this is leading into, in February, Water and Wash Futures conference that encourage all of you to get behind and be part of. We're really excited about this one because in the past, there's been a focus on wash. This is the first time really that this process is bringing in water resources, which, as we've seen today, is so important and critical, particularly in some parts of the world, such as the Pacific. So, Vinaka Bakaluvu, everyone, and yeah, on behalf of all of us involved today, thanks so much, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.